everyone. Welcome to the latest in Dalriada's Tea with Trustees series of webinars. I have my tea here. It's Tea Pigs peppermint tea, hopefully peppermint leaves. That's the packet. I'm not actually being sponsored to endorse them, but hopefully you've got your own cup of tea and we can get started. I'm very pleased to welcome two professional trustees from Dalriada. Alison Stewart, who's based in Scotland, and Sarah Brough, based in London. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So, Alison.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, afternoon, everyone. I'm Alison Stewart. I'm an accredited professional trustee, and I also lead the Dalriada business in Scotland. I'm a trustee on a number of our clients, both sole and non-exec appointments, including some as chair. I also have a very long-held interest in diversity and inclusion, both personally and professionally. In my previous firm, I was chair of the inaugural D&I advisory group. That was back in 2014, and I'm currently a member of Dalriada's D&I committee. Sarah.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Brough and I'm a professional trustee and I'm also an actuary. And as well as sitting on trustee boards, I also sit on boards for the actuarial profession and for a charity. And I've also chaired recruitment panels for the public sector, probably for the last 20 years. And diversity and inclusion has been a key feature of those panels. And it's something I've been interested in throughout my career. So I'm very pleased to be joining everyone for today's discussion.
So the diversity and inclusion, it's a really massive subject at the moment, both in the pensions industry generally, but also in wider society. But what we want to really concentrate on today, given the nature of our participants, who I would guess are probably people who either sit on trustee boards or spend time advising trustees on trustee boards. So what we really want to concentrate on is the practical aspects of how do you actually take better decisions by being inclusive and having a diverse trustee board. I'm going to ask Alison to kick things off and tell us about her view about how we include all the voices around the trustee table.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm going to spend a few minutes sharing my thoughts on how we can get better at including and valuing all the voices on the trustee board. And the foundation of that for me is having both a diverse mix of trustees, and Sarah will talk more about that, but just as important is creating an inclusive environment. But how do we do that? How do we create the right environment? As Brian says, D&I, it's an instantly recognisable term these days, and we're all certainly more informed than we were in the past. But I still think there's more to do to improve our knowledge and understanding of D&I and its application to our day-to-day roles on trustee boards. So I suggest that one of the first things we should do is step back and ask ourselves, do we really understand what inclusion means? And if we don't, or we're not sure, then just as we would with a new piece of pensions law or regulation, we invest the time to educate ourselves. And there's lots of useful resources out there to help us do that. Then as we consider how to encourage and foster inclusion on our trustee boards, we're doing it from a place of knowledge. I also think as individuals, we should have a point of view on D&I and be prepared to open a conversation with our co-trustees, colleagues, sponsors about its importance and the benefits that it brings. Because all of that raises awareness and helps demonstrate our personal commitment to creating the right environment on the trustee board rather than just being seen as tick box. Looking at our roles on the trustee board, we all have a role to play, whether that's as chair, co-trustee, professional trustee, member nominated, the company, the advisors. We all help create the board environment. So it's very much a collective responsibility to lead by example and to influence behaviour. But we all have our own styles. We have our own egos, pet topics and expertise, comfort zones and biases. And that's okay, because we all have bias. It's making the effort to recognise those biases that's important. One of the practical things that I think we can do to help us here, and something that I do from time to time, is to reflect on what it means to be an inclusive leader. And when I say leader, that's leader with a small L. Ask ourselves how regularly we demonstrate the traits of an inclusive leader and how we can improve. Now, you can Google the specific traits, they're easily found on the internet, but it's things like, for example, asking ourselves, am I aware of my biases? What are my blind spots? Do I really have an open mindset? Do I listen without judgment to other people's views? Am I curious? Am I curious about the 2 and 10 views, or do I naturally gravitate to the 8 and 10? Do I automatically consult with one individual on the trustee board or a subset of the board? Do I pay attention to diverse lateral thinking, and do I value that or discount it? Do I help create a safe environment for collaboration and debate? And am I attentive to cultural differences and adapt when I need to? And an important one for me, am I personally committed to being inclusive? Do my actions actually reflect that? And really powerful, if you can do it, is think about taking feedback from others on how they perceive you, especially feedback from those who are different from you. I mentioned our collective responsibility, but it really does all start with the chair to set the tone and to actively bring into play those inclusive leadership traits. The chair is such an important role in any group. The chair should have strong self-awareness and actively work to foster inclusion so that everyone feels valued and safe, importantly, to express their views. The chair builds that trust. And then all of us should have the courage to call out insensitively and appropriately, for example, outside the meeting, any behaviour that we see that isn't inclusive. And then finally, I think we should make time on the trustee agenda for regular shared learning on diversity and inclusion and our approach as a board. We could, for example, have a standalone session, consider having a board policy on commitment and approach to D&I. And all those things will give us a common language and understanding that will help embed inclusion into the culture of the trustee board, which in turn, I've no doubt, will lead to better decision making. And just one final point, it is a continuous process, so we need to constantly monitor and check in on our progress.
Thanks, thanks very, very much, Alison. We're very aware with people from all around the UK at the moment participating in the call, and I have no idea what it's like anywhere else, but it's been absolutely terrible weather in Northern Ireland today. So I'm going to pass you over to Sarah at that point, really. I'm not sure what the weather's been like in London today, but Sarah's going to tell us about the importance of diversity around the trustee table or across the trustee board.
Okay, thanks, Brian. The weather in London sounds similar to Northern Ireland. It's been pretty grim today. But let me talk about trustee boards. So how to bring about diversity and how to include a wide range of perspectives at your trustee board. And I think we all agree that the more diverse your trustee board is, the wider the range of perspectives you'll have to draw on. But diversity isn't only about demographics. There are a couple of others I'd like to mention, because there's experience diversity, which is different socioeconomic groups, different life experiences, and different professional backgrounds. There's also cognitive diversity as well, which is how we analyse and think about problems. Now, if your board isn't demographically diverse, you might want to think about how you could change that through recruitment, because otherwise there's a risk of board members having similar blind spots and fewer perspectives. Now, in terms of blind spots, I was speaking to a colleague about this recently, and we were talking about age being a blind spot for trustee boards. Because if you have a scheme with, say, quite a young membership, but your trustee board is much older, how is that board going to ensure member communications connect with the membership? Because apparently PDFs and websites are a bit old hat. So questions I'd ask are, what media should we be using? What tone of language will we use? And are the images diverse and inclusive? But having younger trustees on your board would provide diversity, different perspectives, and how to avoid a blind spot. Now, I know some boards find demographic diversity difficult for practical reasons, because the board can be quite small or from industries that are not very diverse. So then what can you do? Well, board members could talk to their diverse group of contacts to increase their awareness of diversity issues, or they could build a more diverse network if they don't have one. You could do that through events or introductions, but seeking out external views can be really valuable in helping a board to spot new angles. And even if your board isn't demographically diverse, they may be diverse in other ways through life experiences or cognitive diversity. And having an inclusive environment, which Alison just spoke about, would help to bring out those different points of view. And there are companies who can help in carrying out an assessment of cognitive styles. And maybe some of the larger trustee boards would have the resources to do this. But in the meantime, I think challenge and debate can help to minimise groupthink and draw out different cognitive styles from the board. But another action that the board could do would be an assessment of its skills and knowledge, and particularly knowledge, because it's really important for trustees to understand the technical issues being discussed in order to take decisions on those issues. And once you've identified where the knowledge gaps are, you'll know where you need extra advice and training. So those are my thoughts on how you can bring in a diverse range of perspectives for your trustee board.
Sarah, thanks very much. I should really say at that point, thanks very much to people who actually fed in some questions that we could actually answer during the course of the webinar, and question and answers are open. If anybody wants to post a question on questions and answers in Zoom. And I should also introduce Susan McFarlane, another member of our team. We're very aware with technology these days that the old webinars turned out into a bit of a disaster whenever people lose their broadband connection at home. So Susan is there to take over as chair just in case somebody puts a spade through my line or something like that. So Sarah, having got a diverse board and thinking about the need to take into account different types of view, how do you ensure that the debate around the trustee table tests views in order to reach a consensus?
Oh, now that's an interesting one. Let me take the first part of your question, then I'll come on to the second one. So how do you ensure debate tests views? I think boards have to value debate and encourage it to get the best decisions. And as trustees, we're all trying to make the best decisions for our members. So going back to what I said earlier, having a good understanding of the issues is really important. And for me, that means setting aside enough time to read the papers, understand the key messages and the rationale for those messages. And if you don't, then ask questions. And I also like to find out about other views in the market, not just those of my advisors. And because I'm a professional trustee, I get to see advice across a number of schemes. But if you're not in that position, have a look at some of the websites that the other advisors host, because many have got thought pieces on there and you'll get a wider perspective of the market. But if you do find something interesting, share it with the rest of the board so everybody can consider it and debate it. Including your advisor. Don't gatekeep your knowledge. Now, having an open mind, I would say, is really important for debate. You need to ask for counterexamples and challenge your own thinking and challenge others as well. And don't just look for views that reinforce what you think, because you might get stuck on your initial view. So be prepared to change your mind. And if there are no challenges, you could ask someone on the board to play devil's advocate and ask, what if? And would your decision be any different if? Another thing I want to mention, which is what I see, is informal chats in small groups before the meeting and reaching a decision. Because I think that can limit debate at the board, because the other trustees might feel a deal's already been done outside the meeting. And that might have been the intention of the original group. But, you know, as a question, does that mean you've made the most effective decision? I think boards also need to think about how they use their advisors. Some of the decisions that you have to make on a trustee board are quite complex or quite tricky to understand. And there's a risk of passing the decision making onto the advisor rather than making those decisions at trustee board. But I think, particularly if you're a new trustee, that is a great opportunity to be curious and ask questions and challenge how things have been done in the past. And what you might hear is, oh, we discussed that last time, we've already rejected that. But the status quo isn't necessarily the best answer, or it could have been a good answer back then, but it might not be now. Now, corporate memory is not always a good thing, and sometimes people protect their previous decisions and may resist changing to another path. But Alison said the chair's role is really important in this too. and create an inclusive environment for everyone. And we've all chaired trustee meetings, and as a chair, I try not to put my view out there first, because I get a sense that there's some sort of perceived credibility about the chair's view. And especially if you're chairing as a professional trustee, you can end up drawing the rest of the board around to your own way of thinking, and that can stifle debate. Now, I said, Brian, I was going to take your question in two parts, because what I'm going to do is actually challenge the premise of your question, which is about reaching a consensus view. I think you don't always need to reach a consensus. There might not be one, and there might be a very good reason for that. But I think with a consensus view, there's a risk sometimes of herding people towards where the weight of the opinion lies, so you can get the job done, get the decision made. And then influence can become more important than the debate, especially where there are time constraints. So sometimes I would say you don't need to go with consensus, look for a majority decision, maybe use voting, and that might help to keep a discussion open and not close it down too early. So that's my thoughts on debate and consensus.
Interesting thoughts there, Sarah. You touched there on advisors, and we've got a mixture of advisors and trustees on the call now, and we all value our advisors. You know, they're hugely important, and pension schemes couldn't operate properly without them. But maybe asking Alison. Alison, how do you ensure trustee boards are advised to reach good, effective decisions without simply being advisor-led?
Yeah, and it's a really important area for us as trustees. I think there's a key role here, Brian, for the professional trustee in particular, because we can help shape the advice by asking the right questions, making sure it's focused on the right issues, and that there's the right amount of challenge and debate where that's necessary. I think we can also ensure that the advice is tailored to reflect the scheme's specific circumstances and the nuances, rather than the generic one-size-fits-all. I know we've all had experience of fairly sort of generic standard documents. I think advisors should keep an open mind. None of us always get it right all the time, so test the board's understanding of the advice that's been given, and equally test and understand the board's views on that advice. I think agile working is very important. The time lapse between trustee meetings can sometimes mean that momentum's lost, so we should all be making good use of the time between meetings, following up quickly while decision and debate is still fresh in the mind, to make sure that we take those prompt, effective decisions. And something that's helped partly by virtual, but short-term, more frequent meetings can bring more familiarity with the issues and drive better, more effective debate. I think Sarah touched on identifying knowledge gaps and ideally knowing those ahead of time, so that we can tackle those through learning and training before a complex topic raises its head. And then it's incumbent on all of us, trustees in particular, to set aside enough time to read and understand the information and the advice from advisors. And if we need to, put up our hands early enough and say we don't understand, and get some more detailed information before we reach a decision.
Thanks very much, Alison. We have just again, if people have questions, we do have a question there from Derek Scott that he's put up during the chat here. Now, I have to fully accept I don't fully understand the question, and it may be that neither does Sarah or Alison, but it's how do you reconcile diversity and inclusion, which suggests larger decision-making bodies, with group theory, which supports smaller decision-making bodies. I'm afraid group theory for me sends me back to university and a maths degree, and I suspect that's not what Derek's talking about there. So I'm afraid I'm going to be completely lost on that one, but I wonder would either of you be prepared to tackle that one? Sarah?
I was looking at Alison then to see if you were going to take it first. It's not an area I'm particularly expert in. I am aware that the Institute of Actuaries published quite an interesting report in January this year that talked about bias at trustee boards and general group thinking around making decisions. I think perhaps for all of us that would be an interesting one to jump into and have a little think about after this call.
Thanks very much. We also have an anonymous question here. What's Dalriada's view on sole trusteeship, which is apparently becoming more common? I'm not sure it's entirely on the topic today, but it's an interesting question. I mean, we've always taken a neutral, I'm going to answer that one myself. We've always taken a neutral view on this. We actually have more than half the appointments we're appointed to are sole trustee, but sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. With sole trusteeship, you can, to some extent, you're getting a bit of a pre-packaged when it comes to issues like diversity and inclusion. Your diversity and inclusion is what your sole trustee has. Whereas, I guess, if you're establishing your own trustee board, you can take a more pick and mix approach to it and put together a board that's very bespoke. But they should both get you to the same place. I don't think one's better than the other, unless either of my colleagues have any alternative view on that.
No, I think it should be what's right for that particular organisation and that pension scheme, I think, Brian. And obviously there's a move within the industry to make sure that regardless of the approach that's taken, we consider diversity and inclusion in the makeup of the trustee board, and we do that in the same way with the sole trustee board. If we're involved, make sure we've got the right mix and that it works for the scheme. So as you say, I think both work. Yeah.
Anyway, there's just coming to a question that we actually had submitted beforehand, and as I say, not to discourage people to putting through additional questions if they occur to them. Eve Keith of Unison, I think it's a really interesting question. Do you find it harder to include all voices in the room during virtual meetings? I think I'll put that one to Alison.
Yeah, and this is a question Sarah and I talked about in preparation for today's session, and we had different views actually. But yes, overall, I find it harder. I prefer in person. That's partly down to the technology used, and there's so many different packages, whether it's Zoom, Teams, Skype, whatever, and you need to get used to those. But and the ease with which you can see everyone in the virtual room, it's not always that easy. I also think virtual makes it easier for some attendees to switch off, which isn't a good example to set, especially for lay trustees. On the other hand, virtual meetings are usually more time efficient, but they do and can stifle debate, and I've found that more difficult. So some of the practical things that you can do, like ahead of time, like making sure you understand the package, you can see everyone on screen, you've asked everyone if they can eat, all those sorts of things, and that there is enough time for the agenda to be covered properly and we're not rushing through the meeting, I think is all important. But in short, yeah, I do find it harder. I would prefer to be in the room with my co-trustees.
But Sarah, you're not sure if you agree?
I was saying to Alison that I found it easier to chair trustee meetings on screen because I see everybody in their little boxes, provided there are enough boxes for the participants. And particularly where you need to encourage people to speak, it's more obvious to me who's been silent and to go to them and ask for their views. And I think where people are hesitant to speak as well, they've got other functions here that they can use the hand up function or the Q&A to get into the meeting that way. The other thing that I've found is that people don't dominate the discussion on screen as much as they do in real life. But if somebody does get quite chatty, I have to say I do find it harder to stop that because it's not so easy to give the visual cues. But if I can just go back to Derek's question, I've had just a few minutes to think about it, which I think was about how do you make decisions in large groups when research shows that it's easier to do so, more effective, efficient to do so in smaller groups. I have worked with some large trustee boards who formed subgroups for particular topics like investment and funding and so on. So perhaps an answer to the how to make decisions in larger groups would be to bring together a smaller subgroup of people with knowledge and expertise in those areas to make the speedy decisions and to refer back to the main trustee board.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Derek has contributed something else here. I noticed in the chat there where he's saying he's highlighting, I think it's a book, a colleague who specializes in behavioral economics recommends the diversity bonus, How Great Teams Pay Off in the Knowledge Economy by Scott E. Page, a book published in late 2017. So that might be something some of the people listening to might want to refer to. Certainly, Sarah, the raise your hand button, I wonder could we virtually install that one in all our boardrooms, because we don't actually, I don't think people are very comfortable actually really putting their hand up. I think the raise your hand function is a really neat aspect of Teams. I have one Teams and Zoom. I have one trustee board where I don't know whether it's due to my worse or better chairing skills, but I hear a lot more of them in virtual trustee meetings than I used to. But I don't actually know why. It may be them, maybe me, I'm not quite sure. But I've just noticed something I've noticed on a board that I'm involved in quite a lot. So also another good question here from Alistair McAlinden of Interpath Advisory. What should advisors do differently to help lay trustees with their understanding of the advice being provided? So I think Sarah, do you mind answering that one?
Yeah, I'll pick that one up. I mean, as you know, I've been an advisor for a good 20 years or so before I became a professional trustee. And I find with lay trustees, there can actually be quite a disparity of knowledge from the people who've just become trustees to the people that go to all the pensions conferences and are really switched on and clued up. So I think, first of all, you've got to understand the level of knowledge that your lay trustee has so you can pitch your advice appropriately. And with written materials, try and make your advice as user-friendly as possible. So for me, that meant look at the story your advice tells, keep it relevant, and don't do a brain dump of everything you know into your materials. And I know that's tempting because we've all studied so long to become an expert in our subjects. But I used to keep the heavy details to an appendix so it didn't detract from the story. And then the lay trustees could dip into the more techie stuff when they were ready to read it. Use plain English, no jargons, no acronyms, and say right at the very top of your paper what decisions you want your trustee to make so they don't have to wade through the text to find them. Of course, the obvious thing to do is to offer a one-to-one session with the lay trustees, particularly at the start of their careers, so you can bring them up to speed with the rest of the board. So those are the things that I used to try. Don't know if anybody else has got other thoughts.
That's interesting. The one thought that I'd have is that if you're an advisor and you would really prefer to be taking decisions, there are great careers as a professional trustee, which you might want to consider. I think we've got time for one more question. We have a question from Steve Brough of Mercer. Steve's an actuarial advisor on one of the schemes that I work with. Hi, Steve. How do you make efficient and inclusive decisions when faced with wide ranges of technical understanding on most boards? We sort of touched on all that already, Alison, but do you want to pick that one up specifically?
Yeah, but as you say, I think we have covered it, and I think the key there is the knowledge gaps, investing more time up front to understand what those knowledge gaps are, and so have a sort of trustee training program that makes sure we get to that ahead of when the technical issues come up. Making sure that everyone on the board is as informed as they can be, and making sure that there's space for people to flag if they don't understand and they need more time, and those one-to-ones outside the meeting that we touched on might be appropriate in those circumstances as well. So yeah, I think the biggest issue there is understanding and identifying those knowledge gaps, and then investing time to bring those knowledge gaps up to the same level for most.
Thanks very much, Alison. Well, look, I think we've hit the hour. We promised this is the time it takes to drink a cup of tea. So I hope you enjoyed your tea. Thank you to Sarah. Thank you to Alison. Thank you to Susan, who's been there to support us and was involved in setting this up. But most of all, thanks very much for engagement. We appreciate the questions, particularly the questions people put up during the webinar, which obviously gives us a bit more risk in terms of trying to answer something that we haven't had a chance to think about beforehand. We appreciate that. There will be another Tea with the Trustee webinar coming up soon, which we will be telling you about. And thanks very much. And we hope the rest of the day goes well and that the weather begins to improve a bit.